Hello and welcome. Welcome to my live webinar here for Biology Fortified and for the Science Week for the March for Science. Hello and welcome. Welcome to... Okay, my live webinar here. Where is this coming through? Oh, there it is. That's what's going on. A little technical difficulty there. A tab open was giving me my own voice back to me. All right. So I'm going to give this a moment, let people join up and realize that this is going on. Anybody there in the chat? I see one person already. Is this coming through clearly? Say something, let me know. And I'll get started with my presentation in a moment. So before I get started with the presentation, I want to say I went to the March for Science in San Francisco on Saturday and had a great time. It was fantastic. There was a lot of energy out there, a lot of supporters of science in all different fields, all coming together and marching together. There was certainly some politics there. You can't avoid that. The March for Science was spurred by political risks to science, mostly from one particular politician and party, but no political party has a monopoly on attacks on science. There are different forms of it, and but it was great to see people supporting science in general. And my poster was "Science is my party," and I had a Erlenmeyer flask knocking the donkey and the elephant out of the way. And I look forward to more events and collaborations with the March for Science in the future. All right, so I'm going to get started and talk about GMOs, talk about plants with superpowers. I won't belabor that theme, but I think it's a great way to look at this topic. So my name is Karl von Mogel, and I have a PhD in plant breeding and plant genetics. And I've been following this topic for a number of years, since before I went to graduate school. I was doing a lot of science communication and general topics, writing a column for a school paper. I did a volunteer radio show. And then when I went to graduate school to study plant genetics, I realized that there was a great need for people who could understand and explain this topic to people, because this is an important topic. Actually, maybe I should just say hello here on the camera. Hello, everybody. I'm sporting my DNA shirt. I make these myself, and I rather enjoy wearing my science on my shirt sleeves, and literally. So I'm going to be talking about plants with superpowers, and but a little bit more about my organization, Biology Fortified. So we started back in 2008 on Halloween. A group of plant scientists, myself, Anastasia Bodnar there on the right, David Tribe on the bottom right, and then also, not pictured here, Pam Ronald, from UC Davis. We were the first board members, and we started it as a group science blog. And since then, Kevin Folta on the bottom left joined our board of directors, and Pam Ronald left our board of directors to pursue all of the things that she's doing right now, and including she spoke at the March for Science in San Francisco. So we mainly publish blog posts and provide resources for the public. We have a database of studies. We have some infographics that we work on and some videos, and some of us also give talks in the public for the public, and also science demos. When I was at the March for Science, I gave a demonstration with genetically engineered potatoes to show kids and parents and everybody else there who crowded around what those traits look like and how they can actually see some of these traits that I'm going to be talking about. And then also they can do experiments in their kitchen. And so I'm interested to do more of those kinds of things in the near future. So just as a bit of context on genetic engineering in plants, let's look at some plants here in the wild, as you would normally see in the wild, and think about what those plants may have become. So think of this as the origin story for a superhero. On the left, that humble root actually became the carrot through breeding. Those leaves became lettuce. Those little fruits became tomatoes as we know them today. And then finally, that flowering plant over there is cabbage. And this is the result of accumulated mutations and selection by breeders, by farmers, by consumers, choosing traits that we want, that benefit us in some way, and then bringing those traits together into an individual plant. So in a sense, we're already eating GMOs, not transgenic crops, which I'll talk about in a moment. So I mentioned the cabbage right there. There are actually many different forms of this species that we eat today. There's kale, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and cauliflower. And each one of them have been selected in a different direction, emphasizing flower buds, emphasizing the leaves, and emphasizing the smaller secondary sprouts, like for the Brussels sprouts, and none of them look like their original ancestor. So you might ask yourself, why would we bother modifying the genetics of plants? Now, you've already seen these examples of crops that have been bred from their wild relatives, but maybe we're done, right? Why do this anymore? If you look down the middle of this slide, you'll see a row of wheat plants in a whole field that looks a little different from the rest of them. This is a field in Mexico that I visited at the Center for Maize and Wheat Improvement. That is a variety of wheat that used to be important. It used to be a major variety of wheat that farmers were growing everywhere. It is now no longer an important variety because, as you can see, it looks brown, it looks unhealthy, the diseases have changed, the pests have changed. They evolve constantly. And we have to evolve our crops constantly to maintain production, to maintain our food supply, and keep everybody fed and healthy. So breeders right now in this nursery that you see here are comparing different varieties of wheat that they're breeding to this variety, and they're growing this old variety as a comparison to make sure that the diseases that they're breeding against are present in this field. So there are many different ways that that you can alter the genetics of your crops. There is crossbreeding, or as many people call traditional breeding, and that is on the top left there. That is the most basic form, taking pollen from one flower and putting it onto another flower in order to create seeds in the fruit that are a combination of the two genetics, those two parents, and then you select those to find ones that have the traits that you want. So a lot of crops, all crops today are still involve crossbreeding, and some of them it can, like apples, for instance, it takes about 30 years to go from one cross to a variety that you selected and decided that you're going to plant those. There's mutagenesis that involves taking mutagens such as radioactivity and or chemicals to induce random mutations. So mutations in the DNA happen spontaneously, but with mutagenesis, you can create them more rapidly and try to find some traits that are useful to generate new genetic variation that you can select in your breeding. One good example of that is the Rio Star grapefruit. That bright red grapefruit was a mutant created from a pink grapefruit. There's also polyploidy. That's where you alter the number of chromosomes in your crop. And a good example of that is the seedless watermelon, which has 3 copies of every chromosome, making it unable to produce viable seeds. Now, those seeds, or the seeds to grow these plants, are produced by constantly recreating that triploid from a tetraploid and a diploid with 4 and 2 copies of each chromosome. So then these ones have 3. The plants grow normal, but then they don't produce the seeds. And those are, of course, very popular. And that's the result of polyploidy. There's protoplast fusion. This one is not as common, but there is at least one common trait out there that's a result of this. This is where you take individual plant cells or protoplasts when they have the cell walls removed, and you fuse them together, allowing some of the cellular components to transfer between those two cells. This has actually allowed a male sterility trait to be transferred from radishes to red cabbages. And that male sterility trait helps breeders create hybrids and do their breeding a lot faster. And so that's been a trait that's not something for consumers, but more for the breeders themselves to make their jobs easier. Then now we get to things that we consider genetic engineering: transgenesis and genome editing. So transgenesis means transferring genes from one organism to another, and then and those genes can be modified. Genome editing is like going in with an eraser and a pencil and changing a few of the letters of the DNA, or perhaps even inserting whole genes. And genome editing is a lot newer form of genetic engineering that could create potentially a whole wide range of changes, including duplicating the kinds of changes you could get from breeding. So seems a little cut off on my screen right here, but anyways, this is a picture that shows how genetic engineering works. There's 2 main methods there to insert DNA into plant cells. One of them is to use the agrobacterium, which is a soil-dwelling bacterium that naturally transfers DNA into plant cells. It's actually a pathogen, but what scientists have done is converted this bacterium into a bacterium that just inserts the piece of DNA that they are interested in. And so it's no longer the kind of pathogen that it was before, the ones that are used in the lab. It's sort of a workhorse for transforming cells. And then there's also the particle gun method, also known as biolistics. This is where you take essentially a gun. It was originally a gun, but now there's some that do it with compressed air. But the idea is that you coat small beads with DNA, and then you shoot those beads into the cells, and then the DNA will get into the nuclei of some of those cells and get incorporated into their chromosomes, and then you check them afterwards to see if they have the DNA of interest. So when you have cells that have the DNA that you're interested in, then you grow them on a Petri plate and then treat them with hormones. And then once those grow roots and shoots, you can then plant those plants and then examine them, and they will have the trait that you're interested in. So this is just an example right here of what some of the little tumors that agrobacterium can make look like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about safety of genetically engineered crops and how they're regulated in the United States. Every country is different. Some have single agencies that handle this, but what the United States has is a 3-agency framework called the Coordinated Framework. The FDA handles issues related to safety for food and feed. The EPA handles issues related to the safety of pesticides and what are called plant incorporated protectants, or PIPs. Essentially, if you were to create a genetically engineered crop that has a new trait that protects it, such as from a pest, then the EPA would be interested in that to make sure that what you put in there isn't going to be harmful for non-target species or for humans as well. Now, of course, the FDA is also going to be looking at the safety for humans and for animals. Now, the USDA and APHIS, they handle the safety for agriculture and for the environment. So the environmental impact of it, its impact on farms, whether or not it's going to become weedy and make farming harder for other farmers. So there's actually been a lot of research on the safety of genetically engineered crops. One really good example that you can look up is there is a decade of EU-funded GMO research from 2001 to 2010. And they concluded that biotechnology, and in particular GMOs, are not per se more risky than conventional plant breeding technologies. There's also been statements from the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, and also the National Academy of Sciences, essentially saying the same. Now, there has been a poll by Pew Research to understand this consensus and then how it compares to what the public believes. And so this poll was done of AAAS scientists and members, and they found that when asked whether it was safe or unsafe to eat, that the vast majority of them stated that they were safe to eat. And then a very small minority said possibly unsafe. But then when you compare to U.S. adults, you see a huge difference. For U.S. adults, about 57% said that it was unsafe, and 37% said that it was safe. So if you look at that, 88 to 37, that is a 50-point gap between the scientists and the public. And also they found that the public, when polled in the U.S., said that the majority of them said that scientists do not have a clear understanding of genetically engineered crops. And so this is very interesting to see that the public is not very, doesn't agree with the scientists on this. And the same Pew research survey looked at the issue of climate change. And it turns out the climate change results for scientists was essentially the same. It differed by, I believe, 1 percentage point from the question of consensus on the safety of genetically engineered crops. And of course, we know that the debate over climate change has become intensely politicized, and there are a lot of members of the public, but in different walks of life, different political parties and such, who also disagree with the consensus on climate change. The thing that I find interesting is that climate change and genetically engineered crops are doubted on different sides of the political spectrum. That's why when I was at the March for Science, I had a poster talking about how science is my party, and I reject the rejections of each of those political parties. But this does present to us a huge challenge as scientists and communicators as to how can we help people understand this. One of the things that my organization is doing is a project called the Genetic Engineering Risk Atlas, or GENERA, and you can go to biofortified.org and check this out. But we are maintaining this database and adding studies to it, reading the conclusions, and finding out the funding sources and the crops that they and the traits that they do the research on, whether they're feeding studies or composition studies, studies on environmental impact, and trying to understand what it is all of those studies say and turn it into something where people can actually visually see this. As an example of that, here are a couple of charts that you can generate on our GENERA site, looking at the question of whether or not genetically engineered crops are equivalent, such as in composition or in how the plants grow, and whether or not they are safe to eat, safe for animals and humans to consume. And if you look at equivalent there, that large blue slice is that there was no difference in the composition of these genetically engineered crops. A few had some mixed results, and a very small slice said that there was a difference in composition that was unintended, and then a few others which actually found that modifying crops through genetic engineering caused fewer changes than through breeding. There's even a study out, I believe last week, looking at that very question, comparing a huge range of genetically engineered hybrids to their non-GE counterparts, and finding that breeding itself causes far more changes to the composition of crops than genetic engineering does. So on safety for consumption, we see a similar looking chart. We see 3/4 of the studies that we looked at found no effect on the safety of GE crops, and a small slice found that there was a positive effect, that the change had an increase in the safety or nutritional aspects of the crops, and then a small slice found mixed results that were difficult to interpret, and an even smaller slice claimed negative impacts. And so you can see, whether you're surveying scientists or surveying the scientific literature, you get pretty similar results. Now, a lot of people talk about who funds the studies on genetically engineered crops. And like I said, we're looking at the funding sources and even contacting the study authors to find out how those studies were funded. We actually created a chart here that shows the outcome of the studies that looked at the safety of consumption, and then compared it to the funding sources. So if you see across the top, these are studies that are funded by governments, and then the next one down are industry-funded studies, and then studies funded by competing industries, such as like organic or natural food industries, and independent NGO-funded studies, studies with mixed funding, so multiple sources in different categories, and then ones that we did not have any information about their funding source. And you can see, in whatever category you're looking at, you see a very similar pattern going on, whether you're talking about government-funded studies or industry or not declaring funding source, the vast majority are in no difference in safety. Even this study right here, by itself for competing industry-funded studies, was a review funded by an organic producing company that reviewed the literature and said, yeah, these are safe to consume. Now, maybe it might be interesting to note that you don't see the very many inconclusive ones in like the industry category, or in well, these ones are too small to really see much. But in the industry category, perhaps if they find it inconclusive, they go, well, maybe we should keep looking at this product before we continue ahead with it. And to dispel the notion that industry does not publish negative results, there is a study that was done in Madison, Wisconsin, that looked at allergenicity that found a negative result for a product that was then discontinued and never brought to market. Just a brief look at around the world. The government-funded studies are not all concentrated in just the U.S. We've got the vast majority coming out of Europe. Europe is very politically against genetically engineered crops right now, or at least there's a pendulum swinging back and forth in the politics there. China, Japan, Australia, Canada, South America. These are many of the countries that are funding the research on genetically engineered crops. So, this is global science. It is not concentrated upon one country, and it's a whole scientific community. So now here is a chart that just shows the progression of how many million hectares of genetically engineered crops are being grown around the world. And you can see that it's, as of 2014, it's gone to over 180 million hectares for total. But a very interesting thing happened in 2011. And that was that the industrial nations were overtaken by developing nations in terms of acreage. So this isn't just something being grown by the United States or Spain or Canada. We're talking about Brazil, China, India, Argentina, and South Africa, developing nations, and also increasingly small landholders. So if at any point anything's not coming through clearly, please mention it in the chat on the YouTube channel. I'm not seeing any comments about this so far, so I'm going to assume that things are coming through clearly. And I'll be happy to answer questions at the end if any come up during the presentation. So now I'm going to talk about the actual genetically engineered crops that are out there and some that are going to be coming out. So you can get an idea of what kinds of different GE crops there are. And I'm going to talk about benefits and drawbacks and who they impact. So here is one of the infographics that we created for Biology Fortified. The artwork is done by Dr. Leila Katare, and we collaborated with Ask an Entomologist, with Joe Ballinger, and we put this together to help people understand how this trait works. So one of the most common traits that you find with genetically engineered crops is insect resistance. And this is achieved by engineering a protein from a soil bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. This protein attacks the gut lining of the insect pests that consume the crop. And it's very specific. Some BTs will affect caterpillars, other BTs will affect beetles. And so it turns out that caterpillars and beetles are very common pests for crops. And so this works very well for them. And the way it works is that the protein is inside the plant cells, and it is when the insect consumes the plant and ingests the cells, those proteins are released and then converted in the gut into an active form on the membrane of the cells of the gut, and then they combine to create a pore. And that pore allows the contents of the gut to spill out, and the insect is killed by this process. Now, this doesn't affect us in the same way because we don't have the kinds of receptors that these insects have. The protein is not active in the plant cell Sometimes they've been truncated. They've had a piece removed from it in the process of engineering the crop, and that just makes it so that it gets converted to the active form more quickly. But it's not active in the plant, and it becomes active when it associates with the gut lining and the receptors in the specific insects, and then creates the pore. In us, BT has been well studied. It's been well studied in mammals. It is digested into its basic amino acids and actually ends up becoming part of the proteins that we have inside of our own body, just like any other protein that we consume. So some of the main pests that BT is used to address are things like corn rootworm, cotton bollworm, and soybean looper. And the benefits are that it reduces pesticide use, in particular in insecticides, because that's what it's affecting, and it can also reduce the mycotoxin production. When insects bite the crops, fungal spores get in there, and those fungal spores then they sprout and they produce fungi, and that fungi produces toxins. And so if you have fewer insect bites, you have less fungi and less toxins. So that has actually been very well established. In some of the studies that we looked at for our database that I discussed earlier, many of the studies that said that the crops were healthier were talking about lower amounts of mycotoxins. And but the drawback to this, if you're thinking in terms of a plant with a superpower, if your BT corn has the superpower of BT, what is its drawback? Its drawback is that resistance can develop in pests. In the United States, resistance has been very slow to develop for most of these traits. And the reason is because farmers plant refuges of non-genetically engineered crops, so that the pests will breed with any resistant pests, and then prevent the pests from becoming fully resistant. Now, in some other countries, such as India, the refuges have not been followed very well, or in some places not at all, and so resistance has been developing faster. So that is the weakness of this superpower. And there, of course, can be other BTs developed, other ways of addressing the resistance. But of course, just like with plant breeding, it's a constant process of making sure that we can protect our food crops from pests. So to continue, so if you see on the left, there is BT cotton, different stripes, showing how much the BT impacts the pest populations. This right here is a row of non-BT cotton, and you can see that it's almost completely destroyed. Now, another very, very widespread trait is herbicide tolerance. And you can see some soybeans right here with that trait. There's cotton with that trait, corn, sugar beets, also alfalfa. And what that one does, I don't have a slide specifically for that one. What that one does is allows a crop to be sprayed with an herbicide and be tolerant to that herbicide, allowing the farmers to use that herbicide to control their weeds. Now, the benefit to that is that they can get better weed control while that still works, and they can also it also helps support no-till agriculture. You can see in this soybean picture here, you can see bits of shredded corn stalks from the previous season covering the ground, and that can protect the soil, and then you can plant right through it. And normally farmers would have been tilling the soil to stop the growth of weeds before they plant, but then now farmers have an easier way to maintain their no-till operations. Genetic engineering is not necessary for no-till, but a lot of farmers have said that it's been very helpful for this. and it's kept the rate of adoption very high. And this allows farmers to plant the seeds directly into the soil and then wait for those seeds and the weeds to grow. You spray with the herbicide after, and then the weeds die, and then you can continue to grow your crop. Now, the drawback to this superpower is, of course, when resistance develops with those weeds. There, of course, the potential environmental impacts of the herbicides, and this is something that we, of course, always have to be vigilant about. The benefit with regard to toxicity is that the herbicide that is being used for most of these crops, glyphosate, which is in Roundup, has a lower toxic profile than many of the other herbicides that preceded it. And of course, if you're not able to use Roundup anymore, then you would lose that benefit. But I've heard this often compared to antibiotics. If you continue to use antibiotics, then the diseases get resistant to it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't use antibiotics. But that one's got a bit more of a give and take to it, and I totally acknowledge the drawbacks to it as well as the benefits. On the bottom left, there's also virus-resistant papayas, which have been a great success story in Hawaii. So with some of the other GMOs that are coming out, and some of them are now already out, there are a lot more different traits coming along in different crops. Some of these can improve food security, some of these can improve nutrition, and some of them can help prevent and treat diseases and conserve and restore the environment. And as I've said, the research is worldwide, and it includes not only for-profit research, but also not-for-profit. But rather than just give you a laundry list of plants, I want to reframe this a little. I want to talk about people. So I'm a plant scientist, and if you talk to me about like, oh, well, this trait has these properties, instantly I'm thinking, this is who it affects, this is what the benefits and drawbacks would be, and this is, here's what we should be thinking about when it comes to regulating and growing it. But, not everybody's a plant scientist, but everybody knows a person who can be impacted by some of these kinds of crops. So you're seeing here next to the dork in the pumpkin shirt is Dr. Dennis Gonsalves, and he created the virus-resistant transgenic papaya, the rainbow papaya in Hawaii. And I got to meet him a few years ago in Hawaii when I was speaking there. And I also got to meet this farmer here. His name is Alberto Belmas. And he had taken out a loan. He was struggling with his farm, and when the ring spot virus hit, it was going to destroy his whole operation. He might have lost the farm, or he might have just become very financially insecure while continuing to farm. And this genetically engineered papaya had arrived in time to be able to allow him to grow papayas again and keep his farm. So, you may not everybody knows a farmer. Some people do know farmers, yes, and that's awesome. If you don't know a farmer, go find some. Talk to them about the challenges they have. But many of you probably know a business person. Many people of you probably know somebody who's self-employed, who is taking a risk to feed their family. And whether you're farming or you're doing consulting work, or you're doing writing, if you're a writer and you're working for yourself, you face the same kinds of challenges. And these challenges are actually being felt by people all around the world. On the bottom right are some farmers in Bangladesh who are growing BT Brinjal, or BT eggplant, and they are having a tough time fighting off the pests that are attacking their crops. And I'm going to talk about that trait in a little bit. But let's think about these plants in a different way. Instead of just about plants, let's think about them in terms of the people who they affect. So let's not talk about so much about the plant with the superpower, but who is that plant trying to help? And so I've got a few images here to help us think about this and think about it quickly for each of these as I go through. And so I have the earth to represent the environment. That's all of us. So if it improves the environment in some fashion, that has some impact on everybody. If it is, so I have the tractor for farmers. There are many traits that are specifically helping farmers or could help farmers. There are consumer traits. There are traits that could impact the consumer, whether it has to do with freshness or quality or nutrition or potentially even price. Then there's also the needy. So people who are malnourished, who are food insecure, there are some traits that are specifically intended for and addressing them. And of course, where all of these intersect together are, again, small landholders in developing countries. The environment and the environmental aspect, the farmer aspect, consumer, and the needy all intersect with them. So let's talk about some of these plants. So this is already out. Actually, there are maize plants that have resistance to drought. Now, not like bone dry drought, but have resistance to the kind of wilting and stunting of growth that happens when you have moderate drought. This is actually achieved with a gene that increases the stress tolerance of the maize plants. And so this is something that is important for farmers who may be impacted by a dry year, and then also for the needy. There is a project called the Water Efficient Maize for Africa, or WEMA project, WEMA, that is working on incorporating this and other traits, as well as traits combined through breeding to create drought-resistant crops that farmers, small landholders in Africa can use. I mentioned BT Brinjal, BT eggplant. So this is that same BT, like from the graphic I showed you, but to address the fruit and shoot borer that attacks eggplants. So this is something that impacts farmers. It impacts the environment. The insect sprays are not as necessary with these crops. They can spray less and they get quality fruit. And because these are small landholders, this allows them to, and there have been reports about this already, this allows them to actually, I should change my camera angle here. I realize I'm probably, guess I'm not covering up. Good. Very nice. Just wanted to check my camera view to make sure I wasn't covering the bottom corner. All right, and so the people it's impacting are people who are small landholders, have small farms, and they're feeding their families off of it, and some are actually getting a higher price for their brinjal fruits at the market because they can say that these are sprayed less, and that's something that their customers care about. There are virus-resistant black beans being developed in Brazil. This is good for farmers. You can see the plants across the top have the virus resistance trait. The plants across the bottom do not. You can see the damage from the virus in the field. This is good for the environment because it allows the farmer to grow their crop without having to spray so much for the pests that attack the plant. If you are trying to control the spread of a disease, because there aren't very good cures for viruses, then you want to stop the spread, and that means spraying the insects. And so that's one way that it could impact that. I believe it's still going through the regulatory process in Brazil, but someday it may become available. So there are non-browning apples. Now this is where we start getting into some consumer traits, traits that could actually impact the consumer in an interesting way. I've tried these, and I've tried some experiments with them, and I've done some cooking videos that are going to be out in the next couple of months to show how these work. But they're very interesting. When apples are cut open, as well as many other fruits and vegetables, the enzyme called polyphenol oxidase, or PPO, converts the polyphenols in the presence of oxygen into compounds that turn it brown. So that's enzymatic browning, and it makes the apples unappetizing. It can slightly alter the nutrition at the surface where this is happening. And so these non-browning apples could actually allow consumers to have apples available in a sliced form that wouldn't have been so easily available. And even, if you want to like slice up apples before you, for your kids to send them off to school, you can actually do that, and then the kids will eat them. I know people who have worked in food service, and the impact on that, even like snacks for kids in schools, could be enormous. And as far as the environment, a trait like this could actually help the environment because it would reduce food waste. So now, similar to this, there is a non-browning potato. That same thing, silencing the PPO, polyphenol oxidase enzyme, and it allows the potato to be sliced without turning brown when you slice it. And for potatoes, it can be pretty rapid. And actually, I have an example of one of those potatoes right here. I can pull it out of the presentation. Just go straight to me. This right here is a genetically engineered potato. This, if you were to slice it, would not turn brown. And it also has a couple other interesting traits. I mentioned at the top of that slide that these fry better. These have lower levels of an amino acid called asparagine. When you fry starchy foods with sugar and asparagine in them, it produces a suspected carcinogen called acrylamide. Now, it's parts per billion levels. Don't be afraid of your random French fry. Be more afraid of the calories of that French fry. But this would actually produce less of that compound. And so there's some potential good impacts for consumers there, and then also for the environment, reducing food waste. So if these don't turn brown when they get injured, it doesn't start that decay process, you lose less of the potato to food waste, and more of the potato can make it into the human food supply, and we can get essentially more out of each acre. So let me bring it back to display screen here, and continue to one of these other traits. Now, this potato I showed you also has another trait that's very interesting. These are resistant to a disease called Late-Blight. This is the disease of the Irish potato famine. And you can see some plants in development there that you can see what the Irish potato famine, the Late-Blight, does to those plants. They're totally destroyed and diseased and shredded in the front, and then you can see plants that look perfectly fine behind them. And so this is something that's really interesting for farmers as well as for environmental impact, because then the need for fungicides is reduced, and we can reduce the impact on farms. So there are tomatoes. These are being worked on in England, and they produce anthocyanins in the flesh of the tomato. Now, you can get some tomatoes bred with genes from wild relatives. Now, think back to those to the slide about the different methods of modifying the genetics of plants. There are purple tomatoes you can get. I've grown them myself, called Indigo Rose, and I think they've got some more varieties coming out soon out of Oregon State. And those are not these, but those are tomatoes that produce anthocyanins in the skin of the tomato, and those are achieved through breeding to get these genes that people were not eating before to produce compounds that we find in blueberries and cranberries and other plants like that. And there could be some potential health benefits. These genetically engineered versions, you take a popular variety of tomato and you engineer this trait in there, you can get dark anthocyanin pigments produced throughout the tomato. and there's some potential consumer benefits from that. These tomatoes have been found to have longer shelf life, and through blind taste tests, they tasted better. Now, that's not going to be the only way to improve the taste of tomato. If you want to learn more about that, I check out the Klee lab at the University of Florida. Harry Klee, Klee. They're doing a lot of great work there with understanding tomato flavor and how it is that all those tomatoes in the store don't taste so good, and how we can make them taste better. But this is another trait that could impact consumers. Now, I got a personal connection to this one. My dad is wheat gluten intolerant, and that is caused by a reaction to gliadin in the wheat. There are two main proteins in the wheat grain, in the endosperm. There is glutenin and gliadin. Those together create what we call gluten. So people who are who have celiac disease, they're reacting to gliadin. So there is a group in Spain that has created a wheat that is nearly gliadin free, and they have found that they can still bake bread with it because it has the other protein, glutenin, and they're doing clinical trials to find out whether or not this really truly would be safe for people who are wheat gluten intolerant to consume. If you look at this picture right here, you can see on the left regular bread from your control wheat. Oops. And in the middle, you find the gliadin free wheat, and then on the right, I believe this was made with rice flour to show that it doesn't really hold, because rice doesn't have these kinds of proteins in it. And so you can see you can bake bread with this one, and there could be some tremendous impacts for people's health for those who are actually sensitive to gluten. So there are some crops being worked on that could use fertilizers more efficiently. The impacts could be on farmers, environment, for the needy. There are disease-resistant bananas. One such project being worked on by Pamela Ronald, a former board member of Biology Fortified, UC Davis. You can see her images there, left and right, with genetically engineered bananas being resistant to bacterial wilt. There are other such bananas being worked on in the world, and there are trials going on right now with wilt-resistant bananas. If you want to learn a lot more about that, there is a film that is being shown in film festivals right now called Food Evolution, that is narrated by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and they go to Africa and they see these bananas and they talk to people there, and they show the people who are being affected. You know, this is one of those ones that you can see on the right affects all of the groups here. This affects farmers who are growing the crops. This affects the environment because of the sprays and the measures taken to try to prevent the spread of this wilt. Consumers, to allow them to actually have these bananas, and of course the needy over there in Africa. This is a food staple. Bananas are a food staple here. We treat it like it's a dessert or something to have with breakfast, but bananas are an important food staple in many countries in the world. And so these trials are going on, and the potential impacts could be huge. So saving oranges from greening. If you haven't heard of citrus greening, you need to read this story, A Race to Save the Orange by Altering Its DNA by Amy Harmon of the New York Times. And if you read that story, you'll learn about this disease that is wiping out the citrus trees in Florida and in the U.S. South. And it's been discovered several times in California, including about 2 weeks ago. There was an announcement that citrus greening was discovered again in California on an isolated tree, and California is stepping up its monitoring to try to stop this. But it makes disgusting fruit that turns green. It's no good. It makes the tree turn yellow, lose its leaves, and die. And they, I think, last year lost about 13% of their orange farms, the trees last year. and production is down well below half of what it used to be. And the worry is that the oranges in Florida will be, and other citrus will be gone. There is actually a genetically engineered orange tree that uses a gene from spinach that could actually rescue the trees, and those are being tested right now. So this could impact farmers who are losing their farms. This could impact the environment, because in order to, like I talked about, the spreading of diseases, in order to prevent the spread of diseases, there are all kinds of pesticide controls used to try to prevent the spread of the citrus psyllid that is spreading the disease between trees. So I think I've just got a few more of these to go through. So I'm just going to give you an idea. So this isn't so much of a laundry list. There are a lot of amazing things going on. But I just want to mention there are oilseed crops that they're working on improving the nutritional profile, the kinds of fatty acids in the oils could have some beneficial impacts. This was plants, the Superpowers, but of course I have to throw in the one animal that is still waiting to be released. It's been approved by the FDA, but it is not yet in stores anywhere, because the FDA has to come up with a labeling scheme for it. And that is a salmon engineered to grow faster, or rather grow year-round, and it can be grown in inland tanks. Inland tanks are one of the best ways to raise fish. There are all kinds of tilapia farms and others that are all enclosed and on land, and don't have the same kinds of impacts that fish farming in the ocean does. And so this can kind of relieve some of the impacts on the wild fish stocks, as well as from fish farms. Fish farms are getting better, but this would be another way that people could get more fish in their diet. And so there could be some benefits for consumers there from being able to get access to fresher fish nearby. I mean, I lived in Wisconsin for about 8 years, and there's no fresh salmon there. It's been shipped from a long distance. So, somewhere like that could actually get some fresh fish of different types, including salmon, from traits like this. So the American chestnut was wiped out by chestnut blight over 50 years ago, almost completely wiped out. There are a few trees left and a few that send up shoots, and there are projects to restore the American chestnut using both breeding and genetic engineering. With breeding, they're breeding with the Chinese chestnut, and they've got some trees that are 15/16 American chestnut and 1/16 Chinese chestnut, and they are showing resistance to the disease. There is a group in Syracuse, New York. I got to go meet them a few years ago and see their blight-resistant chestnuts. They have genetically engineered chestnuts that are 99.9999% American chestnut, and then that tiniest infinitesimal percentage of a gene from wheat that produces an enzyme that disarms the acid, oxalic acid, that the blight uses. So, this isn't just about impacts on agriculture or even our oceans. There's the potential to actually restore a native forest by using this technology. There's certainly a lot of debate to be had about releasing into the environment, about what are the long-term impacts. And the thing I find very fascinating and promising by this is that they are working on a strategy to capture all the genetic diversity in the trees that are still alive today and get the resistance traits into that wild, what plant breeders will call germplasm, but get the genetic diversity that's out there resistant to the chestnut blight by using these resistance traits being bred in and engineered into the American chestnut. And then that would allow us to preserve the genetic diversity of those trees. And so it's a very exciting prospect. I won't go into the next couple very much, but there are tearless onions that existed, but they have been locked away. They've never been commercialized, but I did actually get to see one of those plants a few years ago, pictured on the bottom left with our mascot, Frank N. Food. And it is actually a sad story that the life's work of Colin Eadie there in New Zealand was stopped by political action. When we think about the impetus for the March for Science, we do not have tearless onions today because of politics and because of corporations that actually wanted to avoid using this technology to upsell their products, and they've been putting pressure on onion scientists to prevent them from ever introducing this. There are medicines being worked on, Arizona State University and elsewhere, that use genetic engineering. Some of them are, most of them are actually intended for developing countries to make sustainable sources. So the last thing I want to talk about is biofortification. So the name of our organization, it was originally Biofortified. We took it from this term of stronger life, bio being life and fortified being stronger. And we've been following this issue for a long time, but there is a huge problem with vitamin A deficiency around the world. It's called hidden hunger or micronutrient malnutrition. And that is that there are many people around the world, particularly in developing countries, who are deficient in key micronutrients such as vitamin A. We get plenty of vitamin A from animal products and from carrots and from bell peppers and all kinds of other plants that we consume here. But many of the people in these developing countries are impoverished. They cannot afford the diversity of food that we can, and they may subsist on a diet of mostly rice. The impacts of missing vitamin A, and there are other vitamins and minerals that are missing from their diets as well, but this is the biggest one. There are children that go blind every year, and they within 12 months of losing their sight, half of them die, and it's been estimated that about 2 million or so deaths per year may be due to vitamin A deficiency. Like I said, the families cannot usually afford a diverse diet that we can, and supplementation programs are expensive and effective, but limited in their scope. The idea is you give a mega dose of the vitamins they're missing twice a year, so they get a big spike of it, and then it declines down to nothing again, or next to nothing. So there are actually quite a few of these biofortified crops in existence, and they've been hotly debated for a long time. Golden rice is the one that people are most familiar with on the top left. That's been engineered to produce beta carotene that we all get from carrots. It was named after carrots, carotene. And the idea is to produce beta carotene in staple crops. So then the crops that the people in these countries grow and can afford can provide some of these micronutrients so that they can be healthier, and that also improves their ability to, besides just live and see, but also to work and then be able to afford a more diverse diet. It's not a, people throw around the term like silver bullet. Nobody who works on this or talks about it, who knows what they're talking about, says that this is going to solve everything. There's no one thing that solves every problem, but there are multiple approaches being taken, multiple crops, multiple interventions to try to address this. And there are beta carotene producing cassava plants that are being produced. There are maize plants. On the bottom left, there's actually conventional breeding being used to produce orange maize that's been tested and is being grown in Zambia and other countries in Africa, where maize is a large part of the diet. There's a transgenic version, a genetically engineered one, that does the same, that's under development. There's also a banana, which people are dubbing the golden banana, that it was being worked on in Australia. And that one was undergoing nutrition tests at Iowa State University. Pardon me, excuse me. And now, this is where we get into some of the darker side of the fears about genetically engineered crops. A group in the Philippines that did not approve of genetically engineered crops vandalized one of the field trials of golden rice. And moreover, I mentioned the golden banana was being tested at Iowa State University. A group of students got together and protested and said, no, stop doing this. Stop. Don't find out whether or not it works, because we don't feel like people elsewhere in the world should have access to this. This is where it gets into, the ethical dilemmas. I understand, and you need to appreciate this, that the perspectives of people who are often apprehensive or opposed to the use of genetic engineering in agriculture are coming from the right. They're coming from a point of view that has all the best intentions. So think about the choice of whether or not to use a technology like genetic engineering. Think about it like a railroad track with a switch. So we're heading down this track, and we could go one direction or the other. And think about this for genetic engineering in general, or for one particular crop like the golden banana or golden rice. Or the blight-resistant, the wilt-resistant bananas. Now, imagine that you're presented with this choice, and down one road is using the technology and helping people who are being harmed today and tomorrow and in the future. There are if you look down the track, you can see there's plenty of people, ahead of you, let's say, that are being harmed, and you want to switch that track to the track to the right. Now, on the other side is the potential that there could be people who could be harmed in some way. It seems quite unlikely, given the state of the science on this technology, that people be harmed from consuming this. But what about other impacts? What about political impacts? What about economic impacts? What about a farmer who's not growing golden rice and everybody wants to grow it? There's other kinds of harms out there. So there are potential downsides to switching the track and switching the switch to go down this other track to avoid the harms that are on the first track. And the desire to slow down the use of genetic engineering or stop it altogether comes from the same desire to use it, and that is to prevent harm. And our job as scientists is to look as far as we can down that track and evaluate these different options and compare them to find out, as best as we can, what would the downstream impacts be. But you can never see all the way down the track. You can never see all the way down either branch of this. So I think this is a very appropriate metaphor. So while you think about this, consider that the longer it takes, the more people are being affected. There was a study published now a few years ago, and they estimated that the number of life years lost in just one country, in India, due to vitamin A deficiency since 2002 was 1.4 million life years. So that could be 1.4 million people losing 1 year, or 0.14 million people losing 10 years, or you think about if somebody dies in their youth, how many years they've lost, and they calculate and add that up. Of course, you're not going to address all of those with one application of one technology. We need all different approaches working at once. But insofar as we look as far as we can down the different tracks, we have to keep in mind that there are real harms happening, and as we can evaluate everything we can see in the future in all practical purposes down the other track. But at some point, we do have to decide what is most important to us. So enough of enough of moralizing there. Not all of it is heavy-handed like this. Some of it can be fun and interesting. So if you want to find out more about this topic, you can go to our website, biofortified.org. There are also plenty of other good resources, ucbiotech.org. The Genetic Literacy Project has a lot of articles pulled from many sources, positive and negative. The National Academy of Sciences, they recently came out with a report on genetically engineered crops last year that is a really good source of information that talks about the state of the science and the future prospects. The Center for Science in the Public Interest is another good nonprofit organization, and you should check them out. The Food and Farm Discussion Lab, search for them on Facebook and online. And they have a lot of good discussions there talking about this and other issues in farming. Now, if you want to find a consultant organization that takes a somewhat critical stance on genetically engineered crops, I would check out the Union of Concerned Scientists. As far as those who are critical of it go, they, I think, do a better job than most. So feel free to email me, karl@biofortified.org. Follow me on Twitter, KJHVM, and also our mascot, our main account, @FrankNFood there. So let me see if we have anything in the chat, any kinds of questions here. Let me refresh it just to make sure. Checking emails, if we got any questions that way. Okay, none through that route. If you stuck through the whole thing, I really appreciate you listening. And of course, we are always available at Biology Fortified. If anybody's got questions, if you want to invite anybody to give talks. And I hope this gave you a good perspective on this technology and what it can do. Okay, so I don't see any questions in the chat. So then I think I'll end the webinar. I think I've been talking long enough. And feel free to contact us. And I enjoyed speaking to everybody who's watching and listening. And we'll actually have another webinar tomorrow with myself and Dr. Kevin Folt at the University of Florida. We're going to talk about science communication and help those who are spurred by the March for Science, who want to get involved in science communication, to actually start talking about science tomorrow. So go to marchforscience.org and check out the Thursday lineup, and we'll be doing that webinar starting at 2 p.m. Pacific time in the U.S. and 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. So thank you very much, and we'll